This time round, because we were playing on an all-day Sunday, we had a little more time. So we thought, well, let's try out 2 sets of rules in one session. We set up one table. We had 3 sides. There are 3 people playing, myself, Mark and Matt. So it was like a 3-way game, which was interesting. And we started by playing Mark's homebrew set of rules, where the combat is based around cards, which I'll explain in a moment. And after that, we broke out the Osprey set of rules at Ronin, which of course are also specific to samurai skirmishing. We kept the same terrain and scenario for both sets of rules, so we could do a side-by-side comparison. I filmed both games, so that's what we're going to go through now. Because of the length of time we had, and because these things are difficult to do, or at least they are for me, to actually play and film and commentate at the same time, it's a bit of a challenge to my old brain. So I'm not going to go into the rules in depth. I'll pick up some of the main points, particularly with Mark's rules, of course, which have a very nice mechanic for combat. And hopefully this will be enough to give you a flavour of the rules. I'm sure as well, particularly with the Ronin rules, we were doing some things wrong. That might come down to some of the wording, which I'll talk about later on. But anyway, the table is set up, the figures are ready. Let's see how things went. Here's our table set up. So it's very straightforward, village set up with the crossroads. We have a nice carp pond in the middle there that played a part later on. So we're going to have one force coming on at each end and one in the middle. And we've got that nice temple building as well, which unfortunately didn't really play a part in the game, but it does look nice. It does add some atmosphere. And here's my unit. We all have the same force, basically. Samurai Master, who's the commander, standing there at the back. Some Samurai Warriors armed with swords or bows. And a collection of Ashigaru. And I've also got 3 monks at the back there in the orange. I think one of those is a bowman as well. And each unit has its own colour sticker on the base for identification. And here's the chart for the unit types. So this tells you how many cards they get for attack or defence, how many lives they have or hit points, their damage factor, and the turn sequence is straightforward. Everyone gets to move, fire, resolve combat, like an I go, you go system basically. And there's our movement rates, all pretty standard stuff. So for the combat we have a card system. You're given a certain number of cards. The green is the attack and the red is the defense or counter. So if you have a couple of cards, you choose which attack you want to make, and these are all detailed on this chart here, the direction and the Japanese names. The defender then plays a card, and if the counter on that neutralizes the attack, we check on this table here, then it's the attacker that takes the hit. And if the defense does not neutralize the attack, it's the defender who takes the hit. So very simple system, but quite atmospheric. We like this. We thought, is this a wound counter? Ow. It isn't, unfortunately. It's Overwatch. Instead we have wound counters. And so you keep track of wounds on the table. This was okay for characters with just 1 or 2 hit points. But for the masters who had 6, we did end up with quite a pile of wound counters. So we might change that to bookkeeping in the future. So here's our forces then. We've got Mark's troops to the left there, his unit. We've got Matt's coming on in the middle. And my unit is at the far end. So it's going to end up as a sort of fight around the crossroads and that pond. And in fact Mark said he wanted a cinematic ending. He wanted the masters battling it out on the island in the pond, which is kind of how it ended up. So we kick off with Matt moving half of his unit up to the crossroads. As I said, this is I go, you go, so each player takes a full turn of movement, shooting and melee. No activation rolls, no initiative or anything like that. So I thought that worked quite well. It kept the game moving fast, and everyone gets to move all the troops that they wish to. As we were mostly testing the combat and movement rules, we didn't really go for any morale checks in this game. But then I feel for actions at this scale, I'm not sure that morale is such a big thing anyway. my mob starts moving up. And I had a bit of a plan to have my archers keep firing on the crossroads while my other lot moved up the flank there. And my monks were going to sneak around the buildings, maybe try and sneak around to the back of Matt's troops. So that's how things were at the end of turn 1. We had some bow fire going on, but obviously there was no melee as yet. Turn 2, Matt continues his advance. He had a slight disadvantage here in that he was sort of between two forces really. We've got Mark moving troops up to the crossroads. They do shift a bit on the roads under these movement rules. But that was very nice because it did bring them into bow range of my archers, all tucked in nicely behind the hedges there in the fields. So we had another round of bow fire. I don't think it was particularly decisive. There were maybe some wounds given out and an Ashigaru killed. That was pretty much it. And now on Matt's turn, he has his samurai pop out from behind the hedge there into Mark's troops, Ashigaru and a monk. So we get our first melee. Each character gets the appropriate amount of cards, attack and counter. And as we've said with this mechanic, if you fail to defend properly, you take the hit. If you fail to attack properly, you take the hit. Now Ashigaru only have 1 life, so it's instant death for an Ashigaru. And Mark said he really wanted to do this in order to get that cinematic thing of, you know, samurai cutting swathes through other troops. Samurai have 2 lives, so there's the samurai there has taken a wound. And of course the combat will then be played out on the next round as well. So very fast combat system and certainly decisive. That combat continued as more troops from both units came together. And again, as you can see, you know, it really was just taking 1 round to get rid of an Ashigaru pretty much. Maybe 2 or 3 rounds for a samurai. So very quick resolution to combat. Meanwhile, at my end of the table, not much happening. We did get a bit of an archery duel going on between mine and Matt's archers in the centre there. An archery is resolved on a d6 with the usual modifiers for range and so on. And if we fast forward a little, we've got my archers eventually break cover and head up to the pond to take cover there. And my samurai archers have advanced as well, so they're now keeping up fire on Matt's archers in the middle. And you can just see my monks there sneaking up under cover of that building. That led us to another melee over on this side of the board, where Matt's peasants came out to fight my Ashigaru and monks. There I am choosing which card to use. And yeah, this went on for a few turns. It went back and forth, and I think we have to mention this unnamed hero here. This peasant, he was the last one left. He managed to hold this unit off for about 3 turns until he was cut down. He truly died a hero's death. We've got another melee developing around the pond between me and Mark. And this is where we come to our most cinematic event of the game, as Mark's samurai here decides to charge across the pond. So here he goes with a hop and a skip from stone to island to shore to charge my archers. I feel like we should have the Chariots of Fire theme music going there or something. In that big melee by the pond, my commander managed to defeat Mark's commander. That was quite a long, hard-fought battle. So he immediately sought out Matt's commander. He didn't skip across the pond, he went around it. And these two started the final duel. Both had taken a lot of wounds, so it was going to be close. I got lucky with the cards and just managed to get the advantage. Inflicted the fatal wound on Matt's commander, and so just won the day. And that was the end of the game. On to the Ronin rules then. So here's our roster sheet with the relevant statistics for each character. Now, because this is more character driven, more individual figure driven, we had a lot less figures. In fact, we just went for 5 each, 3 samurai and a couple of Ashigaru, just to see how things worked out. And as I said at the start, we used the same table, exactly the same setup and start points and everything else. And under these rules, each player rolls a dice for priority. The highest gets priority, which means they get the choice of when to move their figures and the order that the melees are resolved in. At least that's what we think. We weren't too sure, because having 3 players, we weren't sure if we were doing this right. It seems to be more of a 2-player thing. We got into some archery pretty quick because maximum bow range is 48 inches, which was most of the table. So that started from the first turn. And that's pretty standard. You die roll to hit with your modifiers, range, cover, and so on. So that was pretty much the same as all the other games we've tried. And then we quite quickly got into melee. Now this was a different system, and there were some nice mechanics here. First of all, each character has a combat pool. So when they get into melee, if their combat pool is 3, they choose 3 counters. Those counters can be attack or defend. So we were using red for attack. You then roll for initiative, and you can expend a counter in boosting your initiative, and then you roll for your attacks. Of course, if you're making an attack, you lose a counter. If you're adding to your defense, you lose a counter, and so on. From there, you roll your dice, add in your attack factor, compare that to the defense factor, plus and minus the modifiers, and so on, to see if you inflict anything from a stun to a light wound to a grievous wound to a critical hit. Once all the counters in the pool are used up, that's the end of the combat, and you go back to the next part of the turn. Wounds we kept track of with counters. I feel again that, got a little bit fiddly, so I put those on the character sheet rather than on the table. But we found this a nice elegant system again, and the combats were resolved pretty quickly, and more importantly, they were decisive. So there's the last shot of that temple. Unfortunately, it played no part in either game, but we must build a scenario around it. That's too nice a model not to use. Feedback then after the games. Both games moved pretty quick. We got a resolution with both. The combat was certainly much more deadly in Mark's game. That was one thing that scored 4. Combat was resolved probably within 2 or 3 turns. There was a very definite winner and loser, thanks to this card system. Now, one question that came up was this idea of you play your attacking card. When a person is playing a defending card, how is it that they can kill their attacker? Surely if you're defending, you can't kill someone. You may know that one of my day jobs is a martial art instructor. I've been teaching martial arts for 30 years or so. My main experience is in Chinese and European arts. However, I've had some experience with Japanese arts, certainly had experience with swords, and some of my students downgrade in Kendo and Iaido. So the explanation is this: in the Japanese style of fighting, or at least as we represent it in games and what you see in films, the emphasis is very much on the attack. In European fighting, typically in films, we have a duel going backwards and forwards. That'll either be like fencing, parry and thrust and so on, or we have a shield and sword, and it's like a kind of exchange backwards and forwards. You defend with the shield, you attack with the sword. With the Japanese style, there was not so much emphasis on defense. There might be deflection, but you never block with the sword. So the emphasis was very much on attack. So with that card system, rather than think of defend, a better way to think of it is counter. If I come in with a cut to the head, for example, and you rather ungentlemanly move out the way and avoid it somehow, I'm left very open to your counter attack. So it's very likely that your counter attack is going to get me. And if it does, well, it doesn't take many hits with a big sword, whatever type it is, to do some serious damage. That aspect then of the game, this idea of choosing your cut and then choosing your counter against it, we liked very much. However, it did feel as though we didn't have much agency over the choice. It was basically whatever card you draw. If you're only drawing one card, you've got no choice at all. If you're a samurai, you might have 2 or 3 cards to choose from. But it's still pure chance what the opponent has. So I think the mechanic is sound. If there could be some tweaking around that to make that a little more tactical, then I think that would be a really excellent combat system. As far as the Ronin rule set went, yes, we enjoyed that as well. We were getting good results and resolutions to the combat. One thing that confused us a bit was this idea of priority at the start. We can see it in a two-player game where you've got 2 players only. One rolls for priority above the other. We had 3 players, we had 3 sides, so we weren't sure how that worked. Or even if you had multiple players on each side, you might have 2 commanders on each side. Does everyone roll for priority? We weren't sure about that. And I'm not a big fan of initiative stuff. I think there are some games that do it very well. There are other games where if you roll badly, you can't move at all, which I don't like. So that's something maybe to look at. To be honest, most of the time I prefer simultaneous movement, just writing down simple orders. So I'm probably going to stick with that mechanic for movement. What we did like with Ronin was the combat pool, this choosing of attack and defense counters. Now, it's not quite the same atmosphere as choosing your cut, like in Mark's game, but it does give you some things to think about, and it did feel like it gave realistic results, because if someone played 3 defense counters and was being very defensive, they were difficult to hit. Now, as I said from my previous talk about how the samurai fought, this doesn't necessarily fit in totally historically, but I thought it did give a nice sort of a tactical edge to the game. Something else to think about rather than just rolling dice and seeing if you hit or not. So that's definitely something I think we're going to keep in the future. The Ronin rules also score highly on the organisation charts. They give you lots of ideas for having different bands, different groups, whether they're your typical samurai with a retinue of Ashigaru or similar, whether they're bandits or monks or Chinese or Mongol invaders, all that sort of thing. And of course you've got scope for ninjas as well. There are some scenarios in the book, but they seem pretty limited to just basically all get together in the middle of the table and have a duel. So I'm sure we can work out some better scenarios. I also think with the Ronin rules, you're going to struggle with more than about maybe 6-8 figures per player. So these fit more into that very small scale skirmish. That's not easy to say. Whereas some of our other games have been more sort of maybe 20-30 figures per side, you know. So it's getting that balance between having that feel of individual figures as characters and not getting overwhelmed with, you know, huge prolonged dice rolls and combats across 15 potential sort of fight zones across the table. So the search continues, basically. The plan is now then, having played, I think that's 4 sets of Samurai Skirmish rules and looked at a few others, some of which were quite interesting, one set of which were pretty much totally incomprehensible to me, but that's for another day. I think what I'm going to do now is put all these in the blender and see what comes out. Keep the combat pool idea, work some of the movement ideas from the earlier games or the earlier rules and so on. Put them all together, then we're going to take that down to the club in a week or so's time and see how they work. As always, of course, I'll do a report on that, let you know how things are going. I should also have all my Dixon's figures painted up by then. I've got 18 Ronin and a few more Samurai, so that gives me good incentive to get all those finished. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching. Of course, if you have a favourite set of Samurai Skirmish rules, do let me know. Always interested to hear your opinions, questions, comments and suggestions. Take care, and I'll see you next time.